Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
The first rays of October sun pierced through the tall stained-glass windows of Hogwarts, scattering colored patches of light across the cold stone floor. Professor Minerva McGonagall, now Headmistress McGonagall, walked slowly through the empty corridors of the castle, her wand secure in her hand, while her footsteps echoed off walls that remembered so many generations of students. But this morning the silence seemed particularly deep, as if the castle itself was holding its breath. She paused by a great window overlooking the lake. The water shimmered under the morning sun, but even this familiar sight could not dispel the heavy thoughts weighing upon her heart. 3 months had passed since she officially became headmistress. 3 months since Severus's death had left her alone with that enormous, empty chair in the headmaster's office. Although the walls had been repaired and the damage from the battle removed, something remained broken, something invisible but painfully felt. Footsteps on the stone stairs interrupted her reverie. Filch was climbing up, dragging a bucket of water and some rags behind him. He nodded to her grimly. The old caretaker had never been particularly talkative, but lately he had become even more silent. Minerva suspected why. After everything that had happened, it was difficult to return to ordinary concerns about sweeping corridors and cleaning classrooms. "Good morning, Argus," she said gently. "Morning's a morning," he grumbled in reply. "Though the corridors are cleaner now. The children are afraid to wander about." His words struck painfully at the very heart of the problem. McGonagall knew what he meant. The students indeed wandered the castle less, explored its secret passages less, laughed less in the corridors. Especially after sunset, when the shadows grew longer and memories became sharper. She continued her morning rounds, descending the stairs to the great hall. This was her new ritual, coming here early before breakfast, when the hall was still empty, to prepare herself for what awaited her. The great hall loomed above her, its enchanted ceiling reflecting the gray October sky. For long tables stood in their familiar places, but even now, when the hall was empty, Minerva could imagine how breakfast would look in an hour. The Gryffindor table almost full, red and gold colors standing out brightly in the morning light. The Hufflepuff table quite well filled too. These children always stuck together. The Ravenclaw table with small groups of students quietly discussing homework. And the Slytherin table. Minerva sighed heavily. The Slytherin table would sit half empty, with large gaps between students. Those who did come to breakfast would eat quickly and silently, trying not to attract attention. Most Slytherins avoided the Great Hall altogether, preferring to eat in their common room. Not that the other students openly persecuted them. Minerva would not have allowed that. But the cold alienation, quick glances, careful steps around them, all this created an atmosphere in which it was difficult to breathe. And the Slytherins, with their inherent pride, responded to this by withdrawing into themselves, making the chasm even deeper. The sound of footsteps made her turn around. Professor Sprout entered the hall, her face irritated. "Minerva, may I have a word?" she asked, approaching closer. "Of course, Pomona. What's happened?" "It's about herbology lessons again. Yesterday, I tried to create mixed pairs for working with sunflowers. You know how these plants react to emotions and how important it is to work with them in pairs. But as soon as I paired a boy from Slytherin with a girl from Gryffindor, she refused to work with him. Said she didn't trust him around magical plants." Minerva pressed her lips together. "And what did you do?" "Rearranged the pairs, of course." "But Minerva, this can't continue. I can't conduct lessons properly when half the class refuses to work with the other half. And this boy, he's so quiet now. He used to always ask lots of questions, was fascinated by plants. Now he sits silently in the corner." "Who was it?" "Malcolm Baddock. 5th year. His father, well, you know." Minerva nodded. She knew very well. Malcolm's father had been one of those who stood in the Great Hall 3 months ago with wand in hand, ready to fight against students of this very school. Now he sat in Azkaban, and his son tried to live with that burden. "I'll speak with the students," said Minerva, though she knew a simple conversation would not be enough. "It's not just my lessons," continued Sprout. "Horace says the same thing happens in potions. And Phileas says that in charms, students from different houses don't even look at each other. Minerva, we're losing them. And I don't know how to stop it." After Sprout left, Minerva remained alone in the Great Hall. She approached the staff table and sat in her new chair, the headmistress's chair. It still seemed too big for her, too important. Albus had sat in it with such ease, as if born for it. But she still felt like a transfiguration teacher who had accidentally found herself in the wrong place. Gradually, the hall began to fill with students. First came the Ravenclaws. They were always early birds. Then the Hufflepuffs, chatting among themselves in quiet, friendly voices. The Gryffindors appeared at the last minute, as always, noisy and cheerful. And the Slytherins, Minerva counted them as they entered. 12 students from the entire house. 12 out of nearly 40. They sat in a group at the end of their table, as far as possible from the other houses, and began eating silently. Among them was a small figure that caught Minerva's attention. Sebastian Nott, a first year with curly dark hair and large gray eyes that seemed too serious for an 11-year-old boy. He sat between two older Slytherins who, Minerva noticed, carefully surrounded him, as if protecting him from foreign glances. Sebastian was the son of Theodore Nott Sr., one of Voldemort's most devoted followers. But looking at this little boy, who carefully cut his toast and occasionally cast anxious glances at the other tables, Minerva saw only a child. A child trying to understand why the world treated him with suspicion for actions he could not control. Breakfast continued in relative silence. Students ate, occasionally talking among themselves, but no one laughed loudly. No one joked across tables as had happened before. Even the Gryffindors, usually the loudest, kept their voices muted. When most of the students had left for lessons, Minerva noticed that Sebastian had lingered. He sat alone, as the older Slytherins had already gone, and slowly finished his pumpkin juice, as if unwilling to leave the safety of the Great Hall. Minerva approached him. "Mr. Nott, is everything all right?" The boy jumped, apparently not noticing her approach. "Yes, Professor, that is Headmistress." "Sorry. You have Professor Sprout's lesson now, don't you?" "Yes, ma'am." He quickly gathered his things, but Minerva noticed how his hands trembled. "Sebastian," she said gently, "how are you finding Hogwarts?" The boy stopped, as if considering his answer. "It's big," he finally said, "and magical. But sometimes I feel lost. Not in the corridors, though in them too, but in everything else." Minerva's heart clenched with pain for this child. "You know, Sebastian, when I first came to Hogwarts as a student, I felt lost too. The castle seemed so enormous, and I felt so small. But you're from Gryffindor," he said quietly. "Everyone loves Gryffindors." "Not everyone," Minerva gently disagreed. "And not always. But you know what I learned over all these years?" The boy shook his head. "That home isn't where you come from, but where you choose to stay. And that real magic isn't in the spells we learn, but in the ability to see good in others, even when it's difficult." Sebastian looked at her with his large gray eyes, and for a moment, Minerva saw a glimmer of hope in them. "Do you really think so?" "I really do. Now go to herbology. Professor Sprout is waiting, and sunflowers don't like to be ignored." She watched as he hurried from the hall, his small figure disappearing behind the great oak doors. Then she returned to the staff table, where piles of parchment awaited her, reports from professors, letters from parents, official documents from the ministry. But before diving into work, she approached one of the portraits on the office wall. Albus Dumbledore was dozing in his frame, his long silver beard falling on his chest and his spectacles slipping down to the tip of his nose. "Albus," she called quietly. He opened his eyes and smiled at her with that familiar warmth that always calmed her heart. "Good morning, Minerva. How are things?" "Difficult," she admitted. The children, they can't find common ground. The Slytherins are isolating themselves, the other houses avoid them. I don't know how to change this. Dumbledore was silent for several minutes, studying her face. He finally said, "In all my years here, I noticed one interesting thing. The strongest magic appears not when we try to force something to happen, but when we create conditions for it to happen naturally." "What do you mean?" "You can't force them to become friends, Minerva. But you can create a situation where they'll have to see each other not as enemies or strangers, but as people. And how do I do that?" Dumbledore smiled with that mysterious smile she remembered so well. "Oh, I'm sure you'll find a way. You've always been brilliant at solving complex problems." After the conversation with the portrait, Minerva went to her office. Climbing the moving staircases, she pondered Albus's words. Create a situation. But what kind? The headmaster's office greeted her with its familiar silence. Fawkes, Dumbledore's phoenix, sat on his perch by the window, occasionally letting out quiet melodic sounds. The walls were covered with portraits of former headmasters, most of whom were dozing after a long night. Minerva sat at her desk and unfolded the morning mail. Among the usual letters, her attention was caught by a parchment with the Ministry of Magic seal. Unfolding it, she read an official invitation to a solemn ceremony commemorating those who died in the war, to be held next month. "We invite representatives of educational institutions to participate in the solemn ceremony." She read, but her thoughts were entirely elsewhere. A memorial ceremony. Perhaps this was exactly what was needed, not for the ministry, but for Hogwarts? She set the letter aside and approached the window. Below, in the courtyard, she could see students hurrying between lessons. Small groups, each from their own house, each keeping separate from the others, like 4 different schools that happened to share one castle. Suddenly her thoughts were interrupted by a quiet knock at the door.
"Come in," she called.
Professor Flitwick entered the office, his face expressing concern. "Headmistress, I apologize for the disturbance, but something strange has happened." "What exactly?" "A first-year student, Sebastian Nott, didn't appear for my lesson. Professor Sprout says he left herbology early, saying he felt unwell. But Madame Pomfrey insists he didn't come to her." Minerva frowned. "Did you check the Slytherin common room?"
"Yes."
"Professor Slughorn says the boy hasn't returned since breakfast." Unease began to grow in Minerva's chest. An 11-year-old boy who felt lost in the big castle hadn't returned to his room and didn't appear for lessons. "How long has he been missing?" "About 2 hours," replied Flitwick. "I've already organized searches among the Ravenclaw students, but so far nothing."
"Good."
"Ask all the heads of houses to organize searches in their sectors. And tell Filch to check all the closed classrooms and storerooms." After Flitwick left, Minerva began her own search, wand ready in her hand. She knew the castle like the back of her hand. Every corridor, every secret passage, every dangerous corner. First of all, she checked places where a curious first year might end up. The library proved empty, except for a few older students preparing for exams. Madame Pants shook her head. She hadn't seen a boy with dark curly hair. The astronomy tower was also empty. The north wing, where the old and used classrooms were located, Minerva methodically checked each room, each corner. It was in one of these abandoned classrooms on the 4th floor that she found him. Sebastian stood by an old, dusty table in the center of the room. But something was wrong. The boy stood motionless, as if frozen, his eyes staring at one point, but seeming to see nothing. And in his hands, Minerva's heart stopped. In Sebastian's hands was a small silver medallion that emanated a weak but sinister light. Around the medallion, strange black threads danced in the air, like living darkness slowly wrapping around the boy's arms. "Sebastian," she called sharply, but he didn't react. Minerva quickly assessed the situation. The medallion looked like an old magical artifact, and not a benign one. The dark threads wrapping around the boy reminded her of something she had seen in books about dark magic. Carefully raising her wand, she tried the simplest spell, Finite Incantatem. Nothing happened. The medallion continued to glow, and the dark threads became ever thicker. "Sebastian, can you hear me?" She tried again, approaching closer. Finally, the boy reacted. He slowly turned his head towards her, but his eyes remained empty, as if he was looking through her. It won't let go," he whispered in a weak voice. "I can't drop it." Minerva felt cold run down her spine. This was not just a magical artifact. This was a curse. And judging by everything, quite a powerful one. "Everything will be all right, Sebastian," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'll free you now." But when she raised her wand for the next attempt, the medallion suddenly flared brighter, and the dark threads hissed as they lunged towards her. Minerva barely managed to cast a protective spell. Whatever this was, it proved stronger than she had expected, and she needed help. Minerva stood in the doorway of the abandoned classroom, watching the sinister medallion in Sebastian's hands. The dark threads wrapping around the boy reminded her of something familiar and unpleasant. She had seen similar things in books about forbidden magic that she had studied during the war, preparing for the worst. "Sebastian," she called quietly, keeping her wand at the ready, "can you tell me where you found this thing?" The boy slowly turned his head, his eyes cloudy as if filled with mist. It was lying there in the corner," he whispered in a weak voice. "I thought it was just an ornament. Beautiful, so shiny. And now—" His voice trailed off, and the dark threads became even thicker, slowly rising up his arms towards his shoulders. Minerva felt her heart quicken. Whatever this was, it was acting fast. "Sebastian, try to let go of the medallion," she said, attempting to keep calm in her voice. "I can't." His voice was barely audible. "It won't let go. And it's showing me things." "What things?" "Horrible things. People who are screaming. And fire. Lots of fire." Tears began to flow down his cheeks. "Professor, I'm scared." Minerva quickly assessed the situation. The medallion looked like a relic of dark magic, possibly a remnant from one of the battle magics used during the fight for Hogwarts. Such artifacts often fed on fear and negative emotions, especially from children. She carefully raised her wand and said, "Protego." A silver shield appeared between her and the boy, but the dark threads simply flowed around it, like water around stone. This was something more than an ordinary curse. "Finite incantatum," she tried again, but the medallion continued to glow with sinister light. Suddenly, Professor Sprout burst into the classroom, her face red from running. "Minerva, I heard." She stopped, seeing the scene before her. "Merlin's beard. What is that?" "Dark magic," Minerva replied curtly. "Ask Madame Pomfrey to come immediately. And Professor Flitwick, too." Sprout nodded and hurried away. Minerva remained alone with Sebastian, who stood increasingly motionless. The dark threads had already reached his neck, and his breathing was becoming shallow. She knew she had to act quickly. Approaching closer, but not so close as to fall under the artifact's influence, she tried a different approach. "Sebastian, listen my voice," she said gently but clearly. "Try to remember something good. Your first day at Hogwarts. How did you feel when the Sorting Hat announced you as a Slytherin?" I was happy," the boy whispered. "Finally, I belonged to something, to a place where I was wanted." The dark threads weakened for a moment, and the medallion glowed more dimly. Minerva felt a glimmer of hope. "Yes, exactly. And what else? Try to remember friends from your house. Who helped you on the first day?" "Selwyn." A smile flickered across Sebastian's face. "Selwyn Macmillan. He's a fourth year. He showed me where our common room was, said I'd quickly get used to Slytherin. But the mention of older students seemed to have the opposite effect." The medallion flared again, and the dark threads pulled towards the boy's face with renewed force. "But even he treats me coldly now," Sebastian whispered, his voice weak again. "Everyone avoids me. They say we're cursed, that the children of Death Eaters will always carry the burden of their parents." "No," Minerva interrupted sharply. "You're not like your father. You're you, Sebastian Nott." Madame Pomfrey and Professor Flitwick burst into the classroom. Seeing the situation, Flitwick immediately raised his wand, but Minerva stopped him with a gesture. Careful, Phileas. This isn't an ordinary curse. It feeds on the child's negative emotions. Madame Pomfrey approached closer, her experienced eyes quickly assessing the boy's condition. His life force is weakening, she said quietly. Whatever this is, it's draining energy from him. Can you do anything? Asked Minerva. Not while he's holding that thing. Medical spells won't work until the source of the curse is removed. Flitwick approached from the other side, studying the medallion with his sharp eyes. This is very old, he muttered. Possibly from Grindelwald's time. Or even earlier. Look at these symbols. On the medallion were engraved strange runes that barely glowed in the darkness. Minerva looked more closely. This isn't English magic, she said. Looks continental. Possibly German. Yes, nodded Flitwick. And if I'm not mistaken, this is an artifact designed to destroy will. Such things were used by dark wizards to break the spirit of enemies before battle. Suddenly Sebastian spoke again, but his voice was strange, as if not entirely his own. They will never forgive. Never forget. Slytherins will always be strangers in their own home. No, Minerva said firmly. Hogwarts is your home. But the medallion pulsed even brighter, as if feeding on the boy's pain. The dark threads had already reached his face, and his eyes began to close. We're losing him, whispered Madame Pomfrey. Just then a group of students burst into the classroom. Marcus Flint, a sixth-year Slytherin, was at the front, followed by 4 other older Slytherins, Daphne Greengrass, Blaise Zabini, Astoria Greengrass, and Adrian Pusey. Professor, shouted Marcus, seeing Sebastian. We heard screams, thought. He stopped, seeing the dark threads around the younger student. Merlin's beard. What's wrong with him? A dark curse, Minerva explained briefly. He found a cursed artifact. Without hesitation, Marcus rushed forward, but Minerva stopped him.
No.
Don't come close. It's dangerous. But he's ours, shouted Marcus, his voice trembling with emotion. Sebastian is our first year. Slytherins always protect each other. The other Slytherins nodded, their faces expressing determination and despair. Looking at them, Minerva understood that they were ready for anything to save their younger housemate. Perhaps, she said slowly, the curse can be broken by the force of unity. If you all together. Tell us what to do, Daphne interrupted. Flitwick thought quickly. If this really is a curse of loneliness, then the antidote must be a feeling of belonging. Try speaking to him simultaneously. Remind him who he is to you. The Slytherins surrounded Sebastian as closely as they could without falling under the curse's influence. Seb called Marcus. Can you hear us? You're the smartest first year in years, said Daphne. And the kindest, added Blaise. Remember how you shared sweets with everyone in the common room? And when that third year from Ravenclaw mocked Astoria, you stood up for her, even though you were younger yourself, Adrian reminded him. The dark threads weakened, and the medallion glowed more dimly. Sebastian raised his eyes, looking at his older housemates. You're really here? He whispered. Of course, replied Marcus. We'd never leave you. Slytherins stick together, no matter what. For a moment, it seemed this would work. The dark threads began to disappear, and the medallion's light was fading. But suddenly something went wrong. The medallion suddenly flared with bright red light, and a wave of dark energy rolled through the classroom. The Slytherins were thrown backwards, and Sebastian cried out in pain. Not enough, shouted Flitwick, trying to stay on his feet. Their unity isn't enough. Madame Pomfrey rushed to the Slytherins, checking if they were hurt. Marcus sat on the floor, rubbing his bruised shoulder, his face expressing despair. We couldn't, he whispered. We couldn't save him. Minerva felt her heart clench. She saw pain in the Slytherins' eyes. They had given everything they had, but it proved insufficient. Professor, said Daphne in a weak voice, what now? If we can't help, I need help from the other houses, Minerva said quickly. Marcus, run to the Great Hall. Find the prefects from the other houses. Tell them a student is in mortal danger. Marcus struggled to his feet. But Professor, they won't come. Not for a Slytherin. Especially not for the son of. Try, Minerva insisted, though deep down she doubted too. Marcus nodded and hurried from the classroom. Left behind, the Slytherins helplessly watched as their younger housemate weakened with each minute. The medallion had regained its full strength, and the dark threads now almost completely surrounded Sebastian. The minutes dragged on endlessly. Finally, Marcus returned, but his face said everything without words. They refused, he said quietly. Tyler Boot from Ravenclaw said it was not their problem. Hannah Finch-Fletchley from Hufflepuff, she didn't even listen to the end. And the Gryffindors. What about the Gryffindors? Asked Minerva, though she already knew the answer. Dennis Creevey said that Slytherins are responsible for their own problems. That if we hadn't supported the Dark Lord. The silence that fell over the classroom was heavier than any words. The Slytherins looked at each other with pain and disappointment. Astoria was crying quietly, and Blaise clenched his fists. So that's it, whispered Daphne. We just let him die. Minerva felt something break in her chest. She saw hope disappear from the Slytherins' eyes, saw them realize they were truly alone in this castle. Even faced with the death of one of them, no one was ready to forgive the past. No, she said firmly. We won't give up. There must be another way. Flitwick approached her. Minerva, I'm afraid that without true unity of all the houses we can't. His words were interrupted by a sharp flash from the medallion. Sebastian fell to his knees, his breathing becoming labored. Professor, shouted Marcus, rushing forward despite the danger. Madame Pomfrey quickly assessed the boy's condition. He's losing consciousness. A few more minutes, and it will be too late. Minerva stood, feeling the weight of her helplessness. Before her, a student was dying, not from a monster attack or a mistake with potions, but from people's inability to overcome their prejudices even to save a child. Sebastian, she called, approaching as close as she dared. Hold on. We'll find a way. But the boy no longer answered. His eyes closed, and the dark threads began to completely absorb his figure. The Slytherins stood around, helpless and broken. They had done everything they could, but it proved insufficient. And the rest of the castle had turned away from them in their darkest hour. At that moment, Minerva understood that the curse killing Sebastian was only a symptom of a much deeper disease that had struck Hogwarts. A disease of mistrust, prejudice, and inability to forgive. And if she couldn't find a way to cure it, Sebastian would not be the last victim of this division. The medallion pulsed in the darkness, feeding on the despair and loneliness that filled the room. And time relentlessly passed, bringing closer the moment when it would be too late for any attempts at rescue. The Hogwarts hospital wing had never seemed so quiet and ominous to Minerva. Sebastian lay on a white bed, his face as pale as the sheets, his breathing barely perceptible. The medallion had been carefully removed by Professor Flitwick using complex protective charms and placed in a special container, but its dark influence on the boy remained. The curse has deeply embedded itself in his consciousness, Madame Pomfrey explained quietly, standing by the bed. The medallion accumulated dark energy for years, feeding on despair and fear. Now this energy is poisoning his mind from within. Minerva gripped her wand, feeling her own helplessness. How much time do we have? Hard to say. Perhaps a few days, perhaps a week. But with each hour he grows weaker. And magical remedies are ineffective against this type of curse. By the bedside, Slytherins kept constant vigil. Marcus Flint sat on a chair nearby, his usually cocky face grim with worry and sleeplessness. Daphne Greengrass stood by the window, occasionally wiping away tears. Blaise Zabini and Adrian Pusey sat silently in the corner, their faces expressing a mixture of despair and fury. Professor, said Marcus, not taking his eyes off Sebastian, we thought, maybe if we try again? All together, but stronger? Minerva shook her head. You already risked your lives yesterday, and you saw the result. The curse only became stronger, sensing resistance. Then what do we do? Daphne's voice trembled with restrained emotion. Just watch him die? The silence that followed her words was heavier than any screams. Minerva saw in the Slytherin's eyes the same helplessness she felt herself. They were ready for anything to save their younger housemate, but their strength was insufficient. Suddenly, Professor Slughorn entered the hospital wing. His usually cheerful face was full of concern, and his hands trembled as he approached the bed. "How is our boy?" he asked quietly. "No change," replied Madame Pomfrey. "The condition remains critical." Slughorn sighed heavily and looked at his students. "Children, you haven't slept all night. Go to the common room. Rest a little." "We won't leave him," Marcus said firmly. "I'm not asking you to leave forever, but you won't help him if you collapse from exhaustion yourselves." Daphne approached the professor. "Sir, couldn't you speak with the other houses again? Perhaps if the request came from you." Slughorn shook his head with a sad expression. "I already tried, my dear. Spoke with Pomona, with Phileas, even wrote an official letter to the prefects. But," he sighed heavily, "it seems the wounds from the war are still too fresh." "So, they'll just let him die?" Blaze's voice carried a note of fury. "Because we're Slytherins. Because his father is a Death Eater," Astoria Greengrass added bitterly, having just entered the hospital wing with a cup of tea for Daphne. "They think we're all the same." Minerva felt something clench in her chest. She saw how pain and disappointment on the Slytherins' faces slowly transformed into something else, into bitterness and resentment. "It's not fair," whispered Daphne. "Sebastian never did anything bad to anyone. He's just an 11-year-old boy." "But they don't see that," said Adrian, clenching his fists. "To them, we're all future dark wizards. We all bear the guilt of our parents." Minerva understood she stood at the edge of an abyss. If she didn't find a way to unite the houses now, the division would become even deeper. The Slytherins would become embittered against the whole world, and the other houses would become even more convinced of the justice of their prejudices. "Children," she said gently, "don't lose hope. We'll find a way." "What way?" Marcus asked bitterly. "We've already tried everything. Nobody wants to help us." Just then a small group of students entered the hospital wing. Minerva raised her eyebrows in surprise. These were first years from different houses. A little girl with blonde curls and a Gryffindor emblem on her robes, a Ravenclaw boy with large eyes behind glasses, and 2 Hufflepuff twins. "Excuse me," the Gryffindor girl said timidly. "May we see Sebastian?" The Slytherins tensed. Marcus rose from his chair, his face becoming suspicious. "Why?" he asked sharply. "We were worried about him," said the Ravenclaw. "He's our classmate. Yesterday none of you were here when we asked for help," Daphne observed coldly. The first years exchanged glances, clearly feeling the tension in the air. "We didn't know," one of the Hufflepuff twins said quietly. "Dennis Creevey told us it was a Slytherin matter and that we shouldn't interfere. And now you've decided to come and look at our grief?" Blaze asked with bitterness in his voice. "No," the Gryffindor girl quickly protested. "We really are worried. Sebastian is kind. He always helps when someone gets lost in the castle." Minerva watched this scene with pain in her heart. The first years really wanted to help, she could see that. But the Slytherins were too hurt by the older students' refusal to believe in the sincerity of the younger ones. "Look and go," Marcus said, openly hostile. "But don't expect us to believe in your worry." The first years carefully approached the bed. The Gryffindor girl gasped quietly, seeing how pale Sebastian looked. Is he really feeling so bad?" she whispered. "Dying," Daphne replied curtly, satisfied. Tears filled the girl's eyes. No, I'm not satisfied. This is terrible." The Ravenclaw approached closer. "And what happened to him?" "Nobody explains anything to us." Professor Slughorn briefly told them about the medallion and the curse. The first years listened with open mouths, their faces expressing horror and sympathy. "And you say only the unity of all houses can save him?" asked one of the twins. "So it seems," replied Slughorn. "But the older students don't want to help Slytherins," the Ravenclaw finished. "Yes, we heard." The first years exchanged glances again. Then the Gryffindor girl stepped forward decisively.
What if we try? She said.
First years from all houses? The Slytherins looked at her with disbelief. You, Marcus asked skeptically. You can barely manage basic spells. Maybe, the girl admitted, but we really want to help. And nobody asked for our permission yesterday. Minerva felt a glimmer of hope. What are your names, young lady? Emily Cartwright, Professor. And this is Oliver Twitchell from Ravenclaw, Rose and Ruby Dodson from Hufflepuff. And you're all ready to try to help Sebastian? Yes. All four nodded resolutely. Marcus shook his head. This is senseless. If older students with their experience couldn't help, what can first years do? Maybe nothing, Emily admitted. But we have to try. Sebastian is our friend. Friend. Blaise laughed bitterly. You haven't even talked to him after the first week of term. Because the older students told us not to associate with Slytherins, Rose admitted quietly. But that doesn't mean we agreed with them. Daphne approached the first years closer. Do you understand what you're getting into? If this doesn't work, you might get hurt. And if it does work, the older students from your houses will be very displeased. We don't care, Oliver said firmly. Sebastian needs help. Minerva looked at Madame Pomfrey and Professor Slughorn. Both looked doubtful, but she saw in their eyes the same hope that had appeared in her. Professor Slughorn, she said, could the first years attempt harm Sebastian? Unlikely, he replied slowly. Their magic is still too weak to cause serious damage. But to help. Shall we try? Emily asked. Before Minerva could answer, another student burst into the hospital wing. It was Dennis Creevey, a seventh-year Gryffindor, his face red with anger. Emily, he shouted. What are you doing here? The girl raised her chin. Trying to help a classmate. I ordered the first years to stay away from this situation, Dennis said, approaching closer. This isn't your business. Why? Emily asked. Because he's a Slytherin? Because he's the son of a Death Eater. Dennis exploded. His father killed our people, tortured Muggleborns. But Sebastian didn't do that, Ruby said quietly. He's only 11 years old. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Dennis replied coldly. All Slytherins are the same. These words struck the hospital wing like a curse. Marcus jumped up from his chair, his wand appearing in his hand. Say that again, he growled threateningly. Marcus, no. Minerva quickly intervened, but it was too late. All Slytherins are dark wizards, Dennis repeated, also drawing his wand. Your parents, your families, and you too. It's just a matter of time. The tension in the hospital wing became almost tangible. Daphne, Blaise, and Adrian also drew their wands. Madame Pomfrey stepped back, covering Sebastian with her body. Enough, Minerva said sharply, raising her own wand. No spells in the hospital wing. But Dennis wasn't listening. Do you think we've forgotten? Think we've forgiven what your families did to us? Our families? Daphne asked with pain in her voice. What did my family do, Creevey? My father hid in the manor the whole war, afraid to go outside. And my father fought against Voldemort. Adrian added. He died protecting Muggleborns at the Ministry. You're lying, Dennis said dismissively. All Slytherins lie. It was these words that broke the last straw. Marcus raised his wand, but suddenly little Emily Cartwright stepped between them. Stop, she shouted. Just stop. Everyone froze, looking at the little girl standing between two groups of furious older students. Dennis, she said, turning to her prefect, you can't talk like that. It's wrong. Emily, step aside. You don't understand. I understand, the girl interrupted. I understand more than you think. My grandfather died in the war too, but that doesn't mean I have to hate all Slytherins. She turned to Marcus and the others. And you, stop waving your wands. Sebastian is lying right here, dying, and you're arguing. Her words sounded like a lash across water. Marcus slowly lowered his wand, his face reddening with shame. Dennis also lowered his weapon, but his expression remained hostile. This isn't your business, Emily, he said quieter. You're too young to understand. Maybe, the girl admitted. But I'm old enough to understand what's right and what's wrong. And letting someone die because of prejudice, that's wrong. She looked at everyone present. We can continue hating each other, arguing and blaming. Or we can try to save Sebastian. Your choice. The silence that followed her words was heavy and tense. Dennis looked at the little Gryffindor with a mixture of anger and confusion. Emily, if you do this, he said finally, you'll no longer be a Gryffindor first year under my supervision. The girl looked at him sadly, but nodded resolutely. Then so be it. Dennis stood for another moment, then turned sharply and left the hospital wing, slamming the door. Only the first year's Slytherins and professors remained. Minerva looked at the little girl with new respect. Emily, do you understand what you just did? Yes, Professor. I chose what's right instead of what's easy. Oliver approached her. They'll exclude me from the Ravenclaw community too, but I don't care. The Dodson twins nodded. Us too. But Sebastian is more important than what the older students think. Marcus looked at the first years with a strange expression. Slowly, he approached Emily. Why? He asked quietly. Why are you risking everything for a Slytherin you barely know? Emily looked at him with her honest blue eyes. Because it's right. And because we don't have to be enemies. We're all Hogwarts students. Daphne approached closer, tears in her eyes. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Emily smiled. Just help us save your friend. Professor Slughorn cleared his throat. Well, if we're going to do this, we should do it properly. Madame Pomfrey, could you bring the medallion? I'm not sure it's safe. We'll be careful, Minerva assured. But if this is the only way. A few minutes later, the medallion was brought in a special protective container. Even isolated, it emanated a weak but sinister light. The students stood around Sebastian's bed. The first years held hands, creating a circle around the Slytherins who stood closer to their housemate. What do we do? Asked Rose. Just think about good things, Minerva said. About friendship, acceptance, belonging. Show the curse that Sebastian isn't alone. They began. At first, nothing happened. Then, gradually, a warm, golden light appeared in the air. It didn't come from one source, but seemed to be born from the very atmosphere of mutual understanding and care. The medallion in the container flared with red light, resisting the influence. But the golden glow became stronger with each second. Sebastian stirred on the bed. His eyelids fluttered, and his breathing became deeper. It's working, whispered Madame Pomfrey. But suddenly the medallion exploded with a bright red flash. A wave of dark energy rolled through the hospital wing, forcing everyone to step back. Sebastian groaned in his sleep, and his face contorted with pain. No, Emily shouted. Don't let go. The first years and Slytherins again joined hands, trying to restore the circle. But it was too late. The curse had sensed the threat and mobilized all its forces. Dark threads appeared around Sebastian again, thicker and more terrible than before. The boy screamed, his back arching in pain. Stop, shouted Madame Pomfrey. You're making it worse. The circle broke apart. Students stepped back, watching in horror as their attempt to help only intensified Sebastian's suffering. Marcus fell to his knees by the bed. Seb, I'm sorry. We tried. But Sebastian no longer responded. The dark threads completely enveloped him, and the medallion glowed with triumphant red light. Emily was crying, clinging to Ruby. We made everything worse, she whispered. We killed him. Minerva stood amidst this scene of despair, feeling everything she believed in crumble around her. Friendship, unity, the power of good. All of it proved insufficient against the ancient evil that was devouring an innocent child. But worst of all was what she saw in the children's eyes. The Slytherins looked at the first years from other houses not with gratitude for trying to help, but with pain from realizing that even the most sincere attempts to save their friend had ended in failure. And the first years understood that their rebellion against the older students had been futile, that perhaps Dennis Creevey had been right, and some things couldn't be changed. The division at Hogwarts had become not just deeper, it had become bloody. And Minerva didn't know how to heal it when even the purest intentions led only to greater suffering. Sebastian lay in his bed, surrounded by darkness that consumed him with each minute. And around him stood children who had tried to save him and only hastened his demise. Night fell over Hogwarts, cold and hopeless as never before. The dawn of the third day after the failed rescue attempt was gray and rainy. Minerva stood by the window of her office, watching raindrops trickle down the glass, leaving tear-like tracks behind them. Over the past 2 days, Hogwarts had changed for the worse. The tension between houses had reached a critical point. After the first year's attempt had failed and only worsened Sebastian's condition, the castle filled with an atmosphere of despair and mutual accusations. The Slytherins had finally withdrawn completely into themselves, no longer appearing in the Great Hall even for meals. The Gryffindors, led by Dennis Creevey, openly expressed the opinion that Slytherins got what they deserved. The Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs kept to themselves, unwilling to participate in the conflict, but their silence spoke for itself. And Sebastian. Minerva sighed heavily, remembering her last visit to the hospital wing. The boy no longer woke up. Dark threads had completely enveloped his body, and the medallion, even isolated, glowed with triumphant red light. Madame Pomfrey said he had a few hours left, perhaps less. A knock at the door interrupted her heavy thoughts.
"Come in," she called.
Professor Flitwick entered the office, his usually cheerful face full of concern. "Headmistress, we have a problem. Last night there was a fight between students." Minerva turned from the window. "Tell me." A group of third-year Gryffindors attacked 2 fifth-year Slytherins near the library. They accused them of infecting Sebastian with dark magic to attract attention. "Good Lord," whispered Minerva. "Was anyone hurt?" "A few bruises and cuts. Nothing serious, but Madame Pomfrey was forced to treat 5 students. And this morning the Slytherins announced they would no longer attend any joint lessons." Minerva felt pain grip her temples. Hogwarts was falling apart before her eyes, and she didn't know how to stop it. "There's more," continued Flitwick. "A visitor is heading to the castle. Hermione Granger. She said it was an urgent matter." Minerva raised her eyebrows. Hermione rarely came to Hogwarts without an important reason. When will she arrive? In an hour, perhaps sooner. The owl arrived at 1:30 for this morning. "Good. Ask her to come straight to my office when she arrives." After Flitwick left, Minerva tried to concentrate on current affairs, but her thoughts constantly returned to Sebastian and the division that deepened with each hour. She felt like the captain of a sinking ship, unable to save either the vessel or the passengers. Exactly an hour later, Hermione Granger entered the office. She looked older than her 18 years. Work at the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures had left its mark on her. But her eyes still burned with the same determined flame that Minerva remembered from her school years. "Professor, forgive me, Headmistress McGonagall," said Hermione, sitting in the chair opposite the desk. "Thank you for receiving me so early." "Hermione, always glad to see you. What brings you to Hogwarts?" Hermione took a deep breath before answering. "I heard about what's happening, about the Slytherin boy and the division in the school." "How did you find out?" "Sources at the Ministry. And also," she hesitated, "Emily Cartwright wrote to me. The little Gryffindor first year. She's the daughter of Merlin Cartwright, my colleague at work." Minerva nodded. "Emily is a good child. She tried to help." "I know, and that's exactly why I'm here." Hermione leaned forward. "Headmistress, I can't allow Hogwarts to fall apart because of the same prejudices we fought against. What do you propose we do? All our attempts have failed. The curse is too strong, and the division between students is too deep." Hermione was silent for several minutes, thinking over her words. Then she looked directly into Minerva's eyes. "Tell me about this medallion, about its origin." Minerva described the artifact and its effect on Sebastian. Hermione listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "You said it's continental magic, possibly German?" she finally asked.
"Yes."
"Professor Flitwick thinks it might be from Grindelwald's time." Hermione's eyes flashed with understanding. "What if this isn't just a random artifact? What if it was left here deliberately? What do you mean? Think about it, Headmistress. Someone left a powerful dark magic artifact at Hogwarts precisely when the school is trying to recover from the war. An artifact that feeds on division and hatred. This isn't a coincidence. Minerva felt cold run down her spine. You think someone wanted to destroy the school's unity?
Possibly.
Or, Hermione pondered, or it was a test. A way to check whether the new generation could overcome the mistakes of the past. A test from whom? I don't know, but I know how we can find out. Hermione rose from her chair. I need to see the medallion and talk to the students. They went to the hospital wing together. On the way, Minerva told Hermione about all the attempts to help Sebastian and their consequences. Hermione listened silently, her face becoming increasingly focused. In the hospital wing, they were met by a heartbreaking scene. Sebastian lay motionless, almost completely surrounded by dark threads. By his bedside kept vigil the Slytherins, Marcus, Daphne, Blaise, and others. Their faces were exhausted from sleeplessness and grief. But what struck Minerva most was the presence of the first years. Emily Cartwright sat in the corner of the hospital wing with Oliver Twitchell and the Dodson twins. They no longer tried to approach Sebastian, understanding that their presence only upset the Slytherins, but they didn't leave either. Hermione? Emily said in surprise, seeing the familiar figure. Hello, Emily. Hermione approached the girl and hugged her. How are things? Terrible, Emily answered honestly. We ruined everything. Sebastian is dying, and everyone hates each other even more. Marcus raised his head, hearing the conversation. Granger? What are you doing here? Trying to help, Hermione replied, approaching closer. Help. Blaise laughed bitterly. Everyone has already helped enough. Marcus, Hermione said gently, I know you don't trust me. Am I right? Marcus looked at her suspiciously. You're a Gryffindor, Muggle-born, war hero. Why would you want to help Slytherins? Because during the war I saw what happens when we divide people into us and them. Hermione sat on a chair next to him. And because I saw Slytherins who risked their lives saving Muggle-borns. That's not true, Daphne said sharply. Everyone says Slytherins supported Voldemort. Hermione looked at her sadly. Daphne, your uncle Aristides Greengrass saved me and my family in January 1998. He hid us in his manor for a week while we searched for Horcruxes. Daphne shuddered. Uncle Aristides? But we were never told. Because he asked us not to tell. He said he was doing it not for glory, but because it was right. Hermione turned to Marcus. And your older brother Martin? He's a Slytherin too, isn't he? Marcus tensed. What about him? He works at St. Mungo's. He treats Muggle-borns who suffered from Death Eaters free of charge. For 2 years now. Tears appeared in Marcus's eyes. He never told me. Because he, like your uncle, Daphne, understands the difference between pride in good deeds and boasting about them. Hermione surveyed all the Slytherins present. You think you're alone in this world, that everyone hates you, but that's not true. Many people know the truth about Slytherins who fought against the dark forces. Then why don't they say so? Whispered Astoria. Why does everyone think we're bad? Because it's easier to hate than to understand. Easier to blame than to forgive. Hermione looked at Sebastian. But this boy shouldn't suffer for other people's weakness. She rose and approached the container with the medallion. May I look? Madame Pomfrey carefully opened the protective container. The medallion glowed with a dull red light, and small dark sparks danced in the air around it. Hermione studied the artifact for a long time, occasionally muttering something under her breath. Then she turned around sharply. I know what this is, she said, and I know how to stop it. Everyone in the hospital wing froze, waiting for her words. This isn't just a curse. This is a mirror of hatred, an artifact created by dark wizards to destroy communities from within. It feeds on division, prejudice, and fear. The more people hate each other, the stronger it becomes. But we already knew that, said Marcus. How do we stop it? The artifact has one weakness, continued Hermione. It cannot tolerate true repentance and forgiveness. Not for show, not forced, but genuine. Daphne shook her head. We already tried to unite. It didn't work. Because you tried to unite for Sebastian's sake, Hermione explained. But the artifact doesn't feed on his suffering. It feeds on the division between all of you. To defeat it, you don't just need to unite in a critical moment. You need to truly forgive each other. Emily rose from her place. What do you mean? Hermione looked at her, then at the Slytherins. Emily, can you forgive Marcus for not trusting you when you wanted to help? Of course, the girl replied without hesitation. He was worried about his friend. And you, Marcus. Can you forgive Dennis Creevey for what he said about Slytherins? Marcus gritted his teeth. He called us dark wizards. Said we're all the same. I know, but can you understand his pain? His older brother died in the war. He saw Death Eaters torture his friends. For him, Slytherin House is associated with those horrors. That doesn't excuse. No, it doesn't excuse. But it explains. Hermione approached closer. Marcus, if you can forgive him his pain and understand his fear, the artifact will lose part of its power. Marcus was silent for a long time, struggle taking place in his eyes. Finally, he sighed heavily. All right. I can try to understand him. But that's not enough, said Hermione. We need everyone. Each house, each group must acknowledge their part of the guilt and forgive others theirs. Oliver stepped forward. I forgive the Slytherins for initially being afraid to talk to them. And I forgive myself for listening to the older students' prejudices. Rose nodded.
Me too.
I'm sorry I didn't stand up for Sebastian earlier. Slowly, one by one, the students began to speak. But Hermione understood this still wasn't enough. They needed those who truly created the division. I need to talk to Dennis Creevey, she said resolutely. He won't come, Marcus shook his head. He hates us. Then I'll go to him. Minerva objected. Hermione, this could be dangerous. The tension is very high. Headmistress, we have no choice. Every minute brings Sebastian closer to death. 20 minutes later, Hermione stood before the fat lady's portrait accompanied by Minerva. When they entered the Gryffindor common room, conversations quieted. Dennis sat by the fireplace surrounded by several older students, his face becoming hostile when he saw Hermione. What are you doing here, Granger? He asked coldly. Trying to save a child, Hermione replied, approaching closer. And stop the destruction of Hogwarts. Slytherins are responsible for their own problems. Dennis, Hermione said gently, I know your pain. I know what you went through losing Colin. Dennis's face contorted. Don't you dare mention my brother. Colin was a hero. He died defending the school and friends. He was one of the bravest people I knew. Tears appeared in Dennis's eyes. Then why are you defending those he fought against? Because Colin didn't fight against Slytherins. He fought against Voldemort and his ideas, against hatred and prejudice. Hermione sat next to him. Dennis, if Colin were here now, what would he say, looking at an 11-year-old boy dying because of adults' prejudices? Dennis was silent, but his shoulders shook. He was a photographer, wasn't he? Continued Hermione. He always looked for beauty, even in the darkest places. He saw people, not labels. What do you want from me? Dennis finally whispered. Come with me to the hospital wing. Look at Sebastian not as the son of a Death Eater, but as a child. And if you can find the strength to forgive, not the Slytherins, not the house, but just one frightened boy, then maybe we can save him. Dennis was silent for a long time. The other Gryffindors watched him tensely. What if I can't? He finally asked. What if hatred is stronger than me? Then you'll truly become what your brother fought against, Hermione replied quietly. These words hit Dennis like a physical blow. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. I missed him so much, he whispered, and it was easier to hate than to remember. Hermione carefully placed her hand on his shoulder. I know, but Colin wouldn't want you to hate. He'd want you to remember the beauty he saw in the world. When they returned to the hospital wing, Sebastian was barely breathing. The dark threads had begun to dissolve in the air, a sign that the curse was preparing to absorb the last part of his life energy. "Quickly," whispered Madame Pomfrey. "We have minutes left." Dennis stopped at the hospital wing doors, seeing the Slytherins. His hand clenched into a fist, and his jaw tensed. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't forget." "No one's asking you to forget," said Hermione. "Only to forgive." Marcus rose from his place, seeing Dennis. Their gazes met across the hospital wing. Two young men, both traumatized by war, both carrying the burden of the past. "Creevy," Marcus said quietly. I'm sorry about your brother." Dennis shuddered as if from a blow. "Don't talk about him." "No, I have to say this." Marcus stepped closer. "My father fought on Voldemort's side, and I've had to live with that every day. But your brother, he died a hero. And I envy you that." "Envy," Dennis whispered in disbelief.
Yes.
"Because you can be proud of your family, and I have to be ashamed of mine." Tears began to flow down Dennis's cheeks. "But it's not your fault. You were only 17. And Sebastian is only 11, Marcus said quietly. "And he never had a choice." Dennis looked at the bed where Sebastian lay, a small figure, almost disappearing in the dark threads of the curse. He really is so small," Dennis whispered. "Yes," Emily replied, approaching him. "And he's kind. Always helps when someone gets lost. Shares sweets. Never shouts at anyone." Dennis closed his eyes, struggle taking place in his soul. When he opened them, there was no longer hatred in them, only pain and weariness. "All right," he said quietly. "All right. I forgive. I forgive the Slytherins. I forgive Sebastian. And I forgive myself for the hatred I've carried all these months." At that moment, the medallion in the container flashed with bright light, but not red, but golden. The dark threads around Sebastian began to dissipate like smoke in the wind. "It's working," shouted Madame Pomfrey. But the curse didn't surrender without a fight. The medallion flashed again, now with red light, trying to restore its power. Golden radiance and red light fought in the air of the hospital wing. "Not enough," said Hermione. "We need everyone. Each person must forgive and ask for forgiveness." And then something amazing happened. Students began coming to the hospital wing, first individually, then in groups. Ravenclaws, led by Tyler Boot, who looked ashamed and worried. Hufflepuffs with Hannah Finch-Fletchley at the front. Even several other Gryffindors. "We heard what's happening," said Tyler, approaching the Slytherins. "And I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't help earlier." Hannah nodded. "Me too. I was afraid. Afraid of what others would say if I helped Slytherins." One by one, students began to speak, asking for forgiveness, forgiving others, acknowledging their fears and prejudices. With each word, the golden light became brighter and the red light weaker. Finally, the medallion gave one last flash of red light and crumbled to dust. The dark threads completely disappeared, and Sebastian took a deep breath, his first real breath in 3 days. His eyes opened, at first unclear, then increasingly conscious. He looked around at everyone present, Slytherins, Gryffindors, Ravenclaws, Hufflepuffs, and smiled weakly. Everyone's here?" he whispered. "Yes," Emily replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Everyone's here, and everyone's glad you're all right." Sebastian looked at Dennis, who stood a little apart. You're a Gryffindor?" Dennis approached closer, his face soft.
Yes.
"Dennis Creevy. Sorry for saying bad things about you. You're a good boy." "You're all good," Sebastian smiled weakly. "Even when you argue." Laughter rolled through the hospital wing, the first genuine laughter in many days. Minerva stood by the doors, watching the scene with warmth in her heart. Hermione approached her. "How long do you think this will last?" Minerva asked quietly. "Real changes always begin small," Hermione replied. "With one boy, one moment of understanding, one act of forgiveness. And then they grow on their own." Looking at students from different houses caring together about one little boy, Minerva felt that something fundamental had changed at Hogwarts. Perhaps the scars from the war would never completely heal. But today, in this hospital wing, something new was born, an understanding that diversity could be strength, not weakness. But even in this moment of triumph, Minerva understood that the real work had only just begun. One moment of forgiveness, however powerful, could not instantly erase months of mistrust and hurt. Students behaved politely towards each other, but she saw how some still held themselves cautiously, how old habits of survival prevented them from trusting completely. Marcus and Dennis stood together by Sebastian's bed, but there was still palpable tension between them. Emily and the other first years easily talked among themselves, but older students from different houses still exchanged only polite phrases. "This is only the beginning," Hermione said quietly, as if reading Minerva's thoughts. "Real changes require time and constant effort." Sebastian fell asleep again, but now his sleep was peaceful and healing. Around him, students from all houses gradually dispersed, not in hostility, as before, but simply because it was time for dinner and rest. When the hospital wing emptied, Minerva remained alone with Hermione and Madame Pomfrey. Ash from the medallion still lay on the floor, the only proof of the horror that had nearly claimed a child's life and finally split the school. "Do you think," asked Minerva, "this is really the end?" "The end of the old," replied Hermione, looking at the peacefully sleeping Sebastian. "But the beginning of the new, that's always the hardest part." "Tomorrow will be a new day," Minerva said quietly, "and a new opportunity to build what we started today." Hermione nodded. "And I'm sure you'll find a way to make these changes permanent. After all, now you know it's possible." Night fell over Hogwarts, but for the first time in months, it didn't seem so dark and hopeless. In the hospital wing slept peacefully a boy who had been saved not by magic, but by something much more powerful, the ability of human hearts to forgive and love. And somewhere in the castle, in different dormitories of the houses, students fell asleep with new thoughts about those they had previously considered enemies. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for misunderstandings and conflicts. But today had proved that even the deepest divisions could be healed if there was enough courage to look each other in the eyes and see they're not an enemy, but a person seeking their place in the world. And in this hope, Hogwarts fell asleep, preparing for a new day and new opportunities for unity. 2 weeks had passed since Sebastian Nott awoke from the dark curse, saved not by magic, but by the power of forgiveness. Minerva stood by the same window in her office where she had stood that gloomy morning when everything seemed hopeless. But now the October sun broke through the clouds, scattering golden glimmers across the castle walls. The changes at Hogwarts were slow but noticeable. They reminded Minerva of how seeds germinate, first invisibly, underground, and then suddenly a small green shoot appears, breaking through the soil towards the light. The morning post brought her a letter from Hermione, who had returned to her duties at the ministry but regularly inquired about affairs at the school. "Headmistress," she wrote, "I hope the seeds planted that day are sprouting. Remember, the best gardens require patience and constant care." A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Professor Sprout entered the office, her face glowing with satisfaction. "Minerva, you must see this," she said with barely restrained excitement. "Come to Greenhouse 3. Intrigued, Minerva followed Pomona through the castle to the greenhouses. On the way, she noticed scenes that would have seemed impossible just 2 weeks ago. By the fountain in the courtyard, a group of students from different houses were doing astronomy homework together. Emily Cartwright was explaining something to Sebastian Nott, who listened attentively, occasionally nodding. Nearby sat Ravenclaw Oliver and Hufflepuff Twin Rose. "Look, but not too obviously," whispered Sprout as they approached the greenhouse. Minerva peered inside and barely suppressed a gasp of surprise. Marcus Flint and Dennis Creevey were working together on repotting sunflowers, the very plants that react to emotions. But most amazing was that the plants glowed with a soft, warm light, a sign that they sensed true harmony between the people caring for them. "How did this happen?" Minerva asked quietly. "Dennis came to me 3 days ago," Sprout explained. "Said he wanted to learn something new, to as he put it, understand what his brother saw in the beauty of living things. And Marcus has always been talented at herbology. I thought working together might help them both. Minerva watched as the two young men carefully held a pot with a sunflower, their movements synchronized and confident. There was still a certain stiffness between them, but it was different, not hostile, but simply cautious, like people learning to trust. "Professor Sprout," she heard Marcus's voice, "could you look at this leaf? It looks rather odd." Sprout entered the greenhouse, and Minerva remained watching from outside. She saw Sprout showing the boys something, how they nodded, listening to the explanation. Then Dennis said something that made Marcus smile, not for show, but a genuine, sincere smile. Returning to the castle, Minerva met Professor Flitwick, who was carrying a pile of parchments. Headmistress," he said. "How timely. I was just coming to you with good news. Tell me." The results of the latest charms examinations. For the first time all term, every student passed with acceptable or better. But most interesting, the group assignments. Flitwick unfolded one of the parchments. "Look at this group. Sebastian Nott, Emily Cartwright, Oliver Twitchell, and Ruby Dotson. They created a joint levitation spell that requires absolute trust between participants. The result was, well, simply brilliant." Minerva smiled. "And the older students?" "Oh, that's a separate story. Tyler Boot from Ravenclaw and Adrian Pusey from Slytherin worked on protective charms. At first, nothing worked. The spells fell apart as soon as they tried to combine them. But then..." Flitwick shook his head with admiration. "Then they began to talk. Really talk. About the war, about their fears, about what they felt when their houses were at war. And they created the most powerful protective spell I've seen from students in the last 5 years. It was thoroughly imbued with trust and mutual respect." That evening, Minerva decided to walk through the Great Hall during dinner. The picture that opened before her warmed her heart. The house tables still stood separately. Tradition is tradition, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The Slytherin table was no longer half empty. Students of that house sat together, ate and talked, though still somewhat quieter than the others. But most importantly, they no longer looked as if they were preparing to defend against attack. And between the tables, Minerva smiled, seeing Hannah Finch-Fletchley approach the Slytherin table and say something jokingly to Daphne Greengrass. Daphne laughed, a real, ringing laugh that Minerva hadn't heard from her since the beginning of the school year. By the Gryffindor table, Dennis Creevey was talking with several younger students. Minerva's approached to listen. "It's important to remember," Dennis was saying, "that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the ability to do the right thing despite fear. And sometimes the bravest act is admitting you were wrong." One of the second years raised his hand. "How do you know when you're wrong?" Dennis thought for a moment. "When your hatred starts making you into someone you don't want to be. When you look in the mirror and don't recognize yourself." Minerva quietly moved away, not wanting to disturb this important conversation. She saw how Dennis was growing not just as a student, but as a leader, one his brother would be proud of. The next morning, Minerva met with all the heads of houses in her office. On the agenda was a question she had been thinking about all week. "Colleagues," she began when everyone had gathered, "I want to discuss with you the idea of a new tradition." Professor Slughorn raised his eyebrows. "What tradition, Minerva?" "An annual Unity Day. A day when we celebrate not our differences, but our ability to overcome them." Flitwick leaned forward with interest. "Tell us more." "I'm thinking of a day when all houses work together on joint projects. Not competing, but cooperating. Creating something beautiful together." Sprout nodded. "I like the idea. We could organize a joint garden, a place where representatives of all houses would tend plants together." "What about joint spells?" added Flitwick. "Magic that only works through combining different approaches to charms?" Slughorn smiled. "And a festival feast with dishes prepared by joint efforts of all houses. Each contributes something of their own, but together creates something impossible alone." "When could we hold this?" asked Sprout. Minerva thought. "What do you say about the date when Sebastian woke up? That would be symbolic, the day when Hogwarts awoke to new life." This year we'll hold the celebration later to have time to prepare, but in future this will be our traditional date. All the heads agreed. But Slughorn raised an important question. How do we ensure this doesn't become mere show? That it truly means something to the students? I think, replied Minerva, the answer must be sought in them. Let the students organize this day themselves. Adults will only help when asked. A week later, the whole school was buzzing with preparations. Minerva watched with delight as students distributed responsibilities themselves, resolved disputes themselves, found compromises themselves. Emily Cartwright and Sebastian Nott headed the committee for decorating the castle. They came up with the concept of four colors of unity, decorations that combined the colors of all houses in harmonious compositions. Marcus Flint and Dennis Creevy took charge of organizing sports competitions, but not traditional ones where houses played against each other, but new ones where mixed teams performed tasks requiring different skills. Daphne Greengrass and Hannah Finch-Fletchley organized a musical evening where each house presented their traditional songs, and then everyone together created new melodies. Tyler Boot and Oliver Twitchell worked on an intellectual game, a great puzzle that could only be solved by combining knowledge and approaches from all houses. Unity Day arrived on a cool but sunny November morning. Minerva woke with the feeling that something special would happen today. Leaving her office, she saw that the castle had already awakened and was preparing for the celebration. In the great hall, instead of four separate tables stood one large round table, decorated with flowers of all house colors. Around it were arranged chairs without any division by houses. Sebastian's idea, explained Emily, seeing the surprise on the headmistress's face. He said that at a round table there's no head and tail. Everyone is equal. The first part of the day was devoted to joint projects. Minerva walked around different groups, observing their work. In Sprout's greenhouse, students from all houses were planting the Tree of Unity, a magical tree that grows only through the care of people of different characters and abilities. In one of Flitwick's classrooms, mixed groups were creating a symphony of light, a complex spell where each house was responsible for its part of the light composition, but all the beauty manifested only in joint performance. In the great courtyard, Slughorn was helping students brew a potion of friendship, not a magical potion in the literal sense, but a symbolic brewing where each house added their ingredients, and the result was an aromatic and tasty drink for everyone. But what struck Minerva most was what was happening in the library. Their students from all houses were creating a book of Hogwarts memories, a collection of stories where everyone could write about their experience at the school. Minerva read over one student's shoulder. My name is Sebastian, and I'm a Slytherin. A month ago, I thought I could never be happy at Hogwarts. But now I know that home isn't just your house. Home is the people who care about you, even when you're different. Tears filled Minerva's eyes. She turned the page and read another entry. Dennis Creevy, Gryffindor. I lost my brother in the war and thought hatred would make me stronger. But it only made me lonelier. True strength is the ability to see the person behind the labels and forgive even when it hurts. In the evening, all of Hogwarts gathered in the Great Hall for the festival feast. The round table was laid with dishes from all corners of the magical world. Each house had brought something special, but the tastiest proved to be dishes prepared jointly. When everyone had eaten their fill, Minerva rose. The hall quieted, waiting for her words. Friends, she began, today we didn't just spend a day together. We proved to ourselves and the world that diversity is a gift, not a curse. That our differences make us stronger when we learn to value them. She looked at the students, at Sebastian, who sat between Emily and Oliver, at Marcus and Dennis, who were laughing together over some funny story, at Daphne and Hannah, who were comparing notes in their notebooks. But most importantly, continued Minerva, we proved that change is possible. Even the deepest wounds can heal if we're ready to open our hearts to each other. She raised her goblet of pumpkin juice. Therefore, I propose a toast to unity in diversity, to the courage to change, and to the future we're building together. To Hogwarts, the students responded, raising their goblets. When the celebration ended and students dispersed to their dormitories, Minerva remained in her office. The The portraits of former headmasters watched her with warm smiles. "Not bad for a first time," said Dumbledore from his frame. "Do you think this will last?" asked Minerva. "Minerva," he replied gently, "today you gave the students something more than a celebration. You gave them a memory of how good it can be when people choose understanding instead of hatred. And memories, especially good memories, have the ability to shape the future." Minerva nodded and approached the office window. Outside it was already completely dark, but she could see windows glowing here and there in the castle. Students weren't yet asleep, perhaps discussing the day's events, perhaps simply not ready to let go of this feeling of unity and belonging. She thought about Sebastian, who just a month ago had lain dying, poisoned not only by a dark curse, but by the toxic atmosphere of mistrust and hostility. Now he slept peacefully in his bed in the Slytherin dungeons, knowing that tomorrow friends from all houses awaited him. She thought about Dennis, who had traveled from hatred to understanding, finding in himself the courage to see in enemies the same people as himself. She thought about all the other students who today had made a choice, the choice to open their hearts, trust each other, build something beautiful together. The future of Hogwarts remained uncertain. There would be new challenges, new conflicts, new opportunities for misunderstandings. But today had proved that change was possible, that even the most entrenched hostility could be overcome if there was enough courage to look each other in the eyes and see there a reflection of one's own humanity. Minerva smiled, looking at the starry sky through the enchanted ceiling of the castle. Tomorrow would be a new day, with new possibilities and new hopes. And Unity Day would become an annual reminder that even in the darkest times there is always a choice between division and unity, between fear and love, between old grievances and new possibilities. And in this choice, which Hogwarts students would make each day, lived true magic, not that which comes from wands and spells, but that which is born in human hearts ready for forgiveness, understanding, and love. Hogwarts traditions had been preserved, but a new one had been added to them, the most beautiful of all. A tradition of unity that would remind each generation of students that true strength lies not in victory over others, but in the ability to find common ground with those who seem completely unlike you. Thus was born a new tradition within the walls of the ancient castle, a tradition that promised a brighter future for all who would cross Hogwarts' threshold in the years to come.